So hi everyone. I would like to thank you all for attending this legal careers seminar hosted as a collaborative event between the University of Wollongong's Law Student Society and the Diverse Women in Law. The aim of this event is to highlight some of the alternative career paths available to students and to show how your diversity is an asset in the legal profession. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians of this land on which we are virtually hosted tonight in Wollongong. I would like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. As some quick housekeeping, please note that this event will be recorded for the purposes of being uploaded onto the UOW LSS Facebook page, so please be aware of what you say. Similarly, due to the size of the event, we would appreciate if all students could please stay on mute for the duration of the event. If you would like to ask a question during the Q&A session at the end, please use the raise hand function and I will call out names in order, or use the chat function to type out your question. For those who don't know me, my name is Grace Wellesby and I'm the Vice President Education of the University of Wollongong Law Student Society. My role focuses on promoting the well-being of students and ensuring that all students at UOW feel that they are represented and have equal opportunities in all aspects of their education. It is for this reason that we have collaborated with the Diverse Women in Law, which is an excellent non-for-profit organisation founded by Kirthi Ravi in 2019. DWL seeks to promote, support and empower diverse women lawyers and law students by providing meaningful enablers, including mentoring, networking and awareness-raising initiatives. I've personally been involved with DWL as a participant in quite a few of their initiatives, including their clerkship series and as a mentee in their mentorship program, which paired me with two exceptionally bright and generous lawyers who have been a great support and guidance to me throughout the year and pivotal in my growth as a future lawyer. Being part of such an organisation that actively supports women, especially diverse women, in being their powerful, dynamic and successful selves has been really inspirational. And it's by seeing diverse women in leadership that it becomes attainable for us as law students as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel for tonight. First, Her Honour Judge Yahya. She is a District Court Judge and Chairperson of DWL. Her Honour was admitted as a lawyer in 1989 and worked with the Western Aboriginal Legal Service from 1989 until 1996. She then worked as a solicitor advocate with the Legal Aid Commission, was called to bar in 1999, appointed a public defender and took silk in 2009. She was the first female senior public defender, the first female deputy senior public defender in 2013 and was appointed a judge of the District Court in May 2014. Next, we have Catherine Vigas, Director and Co-founder of Nomos Legal and Secretary of DWL. Catherine is an accredited specialist in immigration law and has been registered to practice since 2003. Catherine is also the president of the Immigration Advice and Rights Centre and a member of the Specialist Accreditation Immigration Law Advisory Committee. Sarah Ibrahim is an Egyptian-Australian solicitor at Legal Aid New South Wales and mother of two. She has acted as the solicitor in charge of Legal Aid New South Wales Southwest Sydney offices and is now the acting manager at the in-house counsel unit. Sarah's career has focused on human rights and social justice, and she has advocated for increased diversity and paved the way for diverse lawyers within the legal profession by creating opportunities for them. Next, we have Ami Singh. Ami is a civil law solicitor with the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency in Darwin. This role involves travelling to remote Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory to provide legal services to Aboriginal clients. Prior to this, Ami was a lawyer in the Commercial Litigation and Intellectual Property Group at Allens in Sydney, during which she also completed a 6-month secondment at the Refugee Advice and Casework Service. She is also a mentor with the DWL Mentoring Program. Finally, we have Kirthi Ravi as our moderator. She is a Senior Associate in the Disputes and Investigations team at Allens and founder and Vice Chair of DWL. Kirthi has graduated with a Bachelor of Law and Commerce from Monash University and has held roles at Norton Rose, the Victorian Royal Commission into Family Violence, Cause Chambers Westgarth, and as a Judge's Associate in the Supreme Court of Victoria. After moving to Sydney in 2019, Keithy commenced her role at Allens, and in 2019 she founded DWL. With that, I would like to pass over to Keithy for any final words of introduction and to get the panel started.
So much, Grace. On behalf of DWL, I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands in which we live, learn and work, and whose cultures are amongst the oldest living cultures in human history. We pay respects to their elders of their community and extend our recognition to their descendants who are present. Thank you so much, Grace. You saved me a lot of time in introducing many things, and thank you for your glowing remarks about DWL and all of us. It's been really nice to be able to engage with students like you and to see the benefit of our programs initiatives so far. I might just quickly add one thing about DWL. We define diverse women very broadly. So we work with anyone who identifies as female and also identifies from an underrepresented background. So that includes Indigenous, culturally and linguistically diverse, refugee, living with a disability, LGBTQI, experiencing or has experienced socioeconomic disadvantage, might be a mature age student or from a remote, regional or rural area. So thank you for inviting me along today. I'm very honoured to be your moderator at our first University of Wollongong event of 2020, which has been a bizarre year to say the least. Wollongong Uni has a very special place in my heart. In fact, our first DWL event ever was conducted at Wollongong Uni in your Liverpool campus back in March of 2019, which seems like ages ago, but that was such an essential first step in starting our presence and establishing ourselves. And fast forwarding to over a year, it's really nice to reflect on little milestones like that to set ourselves up and to see where we've come. So my role today is to moderate the discussion, and I say moderate with emphasis because I have nothing on the incredible backgrounds and experiences that our amazing panelists bring today. I was expressly informed that Wollongong Uni students are social justice warriors, they're human rights champions, they don't care too much about a career in commercial law, so that's a pretty big sign that I shouldn't be saying too much about my background. But what I might do at convenient points is perhaps reflect on my career and what it's like to work in commercial law. I think it's always nice to do a bit of a comparison exercise. I think that's certainly helped me over the years to work out what different career pathways are like. And as the name of this event suggests, it is to really provide you all with some exposure to different career pathways, how we all come from different walks of life and then have made a career for ourselves in the legal industry. So I really hope it's of benefit from you. I will, in terms of questions, I know Grace, you mentioned briefly, I think that you might reserve some time for questions, but we've also seen some excellent questions that you've all submitted at the time of your registration. Because of the limited time that we have and the amazing panelists that I'm sure everyone wants to hear from, I'll try and integrate the questions during the discussion, so hopefully they get answered. If we do end up finishing on time, we might reserve some questions for the end that you might like to ask yourselves. So I might dive straight in and ask Your Honour, to begin with, to reflect on your career. One of the questions I think that's been asked by quite a few students is the nature of the work that comes with working in a non-commercial area. So perhaps reflecting on the criminal defence work that you're involved in for a majority of your career. What was it about that type of a role that was challenging, but of course very rewarding at the same time?
So for most of my time, both as a solicitor and as a barrister, indeed, probably for all of my time, I worked as a defence lawyer in the area of criminal law. And I started my career in Western New South Wales, and that's where I was based for about 7 years before I moved back to Sydney. So I was appearing in those days exclusively on behalf of Aboriginal people coming before the local district and Supreme Courts, and continued to do so when I came back to Sydney. So there were many challenges when I was an advocate. Some of the challenges were in doing everything that could possibly be done to make sure that the interests and rights of your client were met and were championed. But there were challenges because most of my clients were extremely marginalised and very vulnerable people. So they had a lot of difficulties and underlying problems, as you can imagine. So those things were challenging to see. I mean, on a basic practical level, some of the challenges were just visiting clients and trying to get instructions in police cells, trying to get instructions at the footsteps of a country courthouse where there was no legal profession room, and you were taking instructions on the steps of the courthouse before you went into court, having a list of about 20 or 30 clients. So those are some of the practical challenges. But what was very rewarding about it was, besides the connections that you made in the community out there, what was very rewarding was knowing that you did everything that you could do to advance the interests of your client. And there were cases where you saw the tangible results of that. And it might have been, for instance, in ensuring that your client got a fair trial in some very serious matters. And when I moved back to Sydney, I was appearing in murder trials before I was appointed to the bench. And it was rewarding when you could see that you were doing everything possible to ensure that that client got a fair trial. It was also very rewarding when I was appearing for instance, Aboriginal people, particularly Aboriginal women in sentencing matters, when you could make a difference, albeit in the individual case rather than globally, in terms of providing them with the assistance and services to get them housing, to get them employment, to help them get their children back, things of that nature. So in the individual case, you could really make a difference. Generally speaking, because of the limitations in the criminal justice system, you couldn't affect any real change. But in the individual case, you could on occasion, and that was very rewarding.
And because you were based in Western New South Wales, I appreciate there might have been additional challenges arising from the fact that you're away from the city or in a new environment, in addition to the challenging aspect of your role itself. How did you encounter that, and how did you get through that every day?
Well, on a personal level, I mean, I can remember the first week that I started at the Western Aboriginal Legal Service, and I was based in Dubbo, and I had been a Sydney girl before that. And I remember realising that there were only really two main streets in Dubbo, and I had no friends or family in Dubbo and felt very isolated. And I remember the first week feeling very isolated and very distressed really about the decision that I'd made to go out there. But it didn't take very long at all. So it was a week that I felt like that. But after that, the connections that I made, particularly with people in the Aboriginal community, and there was a particular family that took me on. I was basically taken on as one of their daughters. And that was immensely rewarding. So it was really about the connections that you made out there. And if you working in Aboriginal communities, those connections are very rewarding. The people that I worked with, so we were all young lawyers working in the country, fighting the good fight, and all sort of having moved from our families and our friends, and we bonded. So that was a real strength that we could draw on. So those things helped. I mean, initially isolated and quite distressingly so. But that, as I say, did not last for long. And then, of course, the work is so rewarding that it didn't take long at all to settle in.
Yeah, that's great. And I suspect after months in lockdown, the logical next step for all of us is to take on a career in rural areas. I think we'll be much more equipped to take on something like that. Thank you, Judge Yahia. I might go to you, Sarah, next. I know you've held a variety of roles in legal aid over the years, but we all want to know what it's like to work at legal aid. What's a typical day like? You almost need to, that could take a while, especially given all the different roles that you've been in, but perhaps one that stands out to you. Maybe something that's slightly different to the criminal law work that you've been involved in, and what it's like to work in that environment.
I mean, a typical day in all of legal aid work is not that dissimilar to what the judge was talking about in relation to all of these challenges that that are faced. So but to give you a kind of some insight into, because I've worn different hats in working in general civil law, in criminal defence, and now in it's more corporate governance. But civil law is the space that I spent the most time in because I was looking at civil rights issues. And so how I generate work, or how work is generated in that space, is we have clinics, and these are advice clinics where people come in, they drop in, and it's very, very demanding in the sense that, I mean, during COVID things have changed, which probably will be interesting how we evolve, but there'd be like 10, 15 people waiting in a waiting room for you to see them. A bit like going to the doctor, and just when you go to the medical centre and you're waiting, it's terrible. So we tried to stage them, we give them times, and you could get all sorts of questions. And the ones which we would take on, or I would take on, we have guidelines. So they're mostly things that the private sector doesn't do, and they are to do with people's civil rights. So that's once you give them advice, you determine whether they fall within the guidelines, and then you can offer them some level of assistance. It's always the advice, but some level of assistance, or you decide whether you're going to litigate the matter for them or be involved or provide some sort of representation. And it's in a lot of tribunal and court, the smaller claims work, not necessarily, but it depends what the type of matter is. So there are some stuff that involves the equitable jurisdiction in the Supreme Court. So it was very demanding in relation to the clinic days, and then you have to follow up by the admin stuff, and then you've got to actually do that work that's necessary for each of those clients. When you're doing criminal defence work, it's turning up to court. Well, when I was doing duty work. So basically everyone that was in custody that required representation, or we would see whether or not they needed a legal aid solicitor, and basically usually we're seeking bail for them, or we're doing some sort of submissions or mentions in relation to sentencing or adjournments. That's the type of thing and it's very, very busy, the local court, which I'm sure the judge can speak to more. But ironically enough, my career started off at Dubbo Legal Aid. And so, and listening to the judge speak about her experience, the judge probably thinks I was stalking her, but in reality, I think I got to Sydney when I was living in this amazing share house in Paddington, and I'd moved from my job, like I was still at Legal Aid, but I'd moved to the city office, and my housemate said to me, "Have you met Judge Dina Yahya? Have you met her? Because her life sounds like yours. Are you going to become her?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She's like, "Oh, so many similarities." So the judge had gone and done a talk at some big private consulting firm or something, because this is where my housemate lived. And so she's coming back speaking about the judge that's completely unrelated. All her work was at, I can't remember which, I think it was one of those Accenture or PwC, one of those big, she's had so many different consulting jobs. So I thought that was interesting, but I mean, obviously we all knew you before, because legal aid, all of the legal aid solicitors in the regions are all hanging out with the ALS solicitors. So it's all a community. And that's generally speaking, when you do community law, you end up knowing everyone in the sector. You form those friendships, and you have all those wartime stories to speak about. So the challenges it's some of the most important work, because you're talking about people's the right to a fair trial, or the right to shelter, or the right to, live a life where you have some dignity and respect, and your human rights are respected. And that could involve, like, it's the only place where I could sue someone for being racist, and they'd literally pay me to do it. So it's very hard to do. It's not, the laws themselves, and the people that want to give you the stories and, providing evidence, it doesn't make it that linear, but still it's a place where, your values are entrenched in that workplace. And, but it doesn't mean that the workplace itself doesn't still have the other systemic issues, like, because legal aid is still part of it's an institution like any other institution. So I think they've only had one female CEO. But yeah, I think the biggest challenges are the systemic challenges, and I'm not talking about in legal aid itself, but the most difficult stuff is the fact that despite your best efforts, you're working on the peripheries of everything, because they're really, you need to make real systemic change on, and that's what matters, so you can help the collective. But otherwise, you're helping individual by individual by individual, and even then, the way policies and laws are written, there's sometimes so far away from, or sometimes it's intentional, and that's the sad part, but the impact that they have on the individual, whether it's access to Centrelink, just so people can actually buy necessary goods and keep a roof over their head, the way the policies are written makes it very difficult for people to get proper support, or in relation to maintaining their housing or getting housing, or all these aspects that are really just the basics in life, which people don't really appreciate, that Australia just generally has these really systemic issues that are really related to poverty, other than all those other issues like class, obviously class, but I mean gender and race, that, you know, there's still the basic of, yeah, we have a huge amount of people still living in poverty. So the impact of that and the way the law interacts with that is huge.
And I guess it's all about those wins. When you do get that win and you are able to get that great outcome for someone or for your client, it's feeling like no other, just based on the nature of the work that you're doing. So that's really great to hear. Might go to you, Catherine. You run your own practice. You're an immigration law professional, actually an accredited professional specialist in that field, so the highest of all authorities in your field. Please tell us a little bit about what it's like to run your own practice. I assume that comes with challenges of its own. What led you to this particular field, and what you find really rewarding about it?
Similar to both Sarah and Hirona, the clients really have been the most challenging as well as the most rewarding. So I started out in the community legal sector. My first job was at the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre. My first paid law job was at the HIV/AIDS Legal Centre, and I started as a solicitor there. And immigration at that point, probably 2003-04, was quite topical. So a lot of the work that I was seeing at HALC had to do with people who couldn't meet the requirements for an Australian visa because they were HIV positive. And I guess how I fell into it was because I was, I had to pick these matters up. And the beauty of the work that we were doing at HALC was that, to be able to qualify for our services, your concern had to be related to your HIV status. So I got to deal with a wide range of types of issues, but also within the immigration program, a wide range of a wide cohort of clients. So there were refugees and asylum seekers, there were partners, children. So it exposed me to quite a lot. And I worked out pretty quickly that I was really interested in that aspect of an individual's journey. I think, having come from a migrant background myself, there was something quite appealing to me to help other people do the same thing. It was people-focused. That was really all I ever wanted to do in law. I just wanted to do something that put me in touch with people and allowed me to be, part of a really important and positive change in their lives. Whilst it's not always a positive outcome for a lot of the clients that we see, it's certainly life-changing, put it that way. So I guess that was what attracted me to it, and that's what's kept me in it. And I think for me, I worked out that the community legal sector probably wasn't going to tick all of my personal boxes for various reasons. Some of them are to do with the structural barriers that you encounter, I guess, throughout the profession. So one of the things I decided that I was going to do with a group of like-minded other people who I was really fortunate to meet was to establish my own practice. And it was not something I'd ever actually turned my mind to. When I think about it, it was probably a really rash decision, but it was made for the right reasons. And it wasn't easy. I have to say, it was probably one of the most challenging things I've done. I'm kind of reliving a lot of that with the whole COVID thing. It's making me reflect on a lot of things that I've done certainly at setup phase. But I think there's two parts to being somebody who has their own practice. There's the lawyer hat and there's the business person hat. And very often they are in competition. So I often have clients who I'd like to spend a lot of time on. It's just not cost effective to do that. I have to think about my other clients. I have to think about my overheads, my staff, all the rest of it. So it's been a learning curve for me in that sense, because I considered myself, and still do, consider myself to be a lawyer rather than a businesswoman. And yet I think I'm a combination of both now. And it's been interesting over the course of my career to work out what appeals to me more than anything else. And I think that still comes down to the people aspect. So it's the people aspect of dealing with the immigration system. It's the people aspect of running my practice, and all the, the filing of BAS and the account statements and all of those sorts of things are the things that I really don't enjoy, but it's a necessary evil. So it's been a really good learning curve, put it that way.
It's almost like being a barrister, it sounds like, because you're essentially reporting to yourself, and everything that you do affects the bottom line. And are those skills you picked up over time, Catherine, or is that just something
Definitely.
that you developed or had special training for? Because it sounds
Absolutely
incredibly
no
challenging.
training. Absolutely no training. And I think it is all, it's like barristers, you learn that as you go. I think the fact that you're accountable to other people, so I've always had business partners, I've never been a sole practitioner, so there are other people that I am accountable to, and vice versa. I think that has helped. A lot of things I've learned the hard way, and you have to take it on the chin. Some months are going to be harder than others. Some challenges are going to be bigger than others. Any sort of challenge, I think, to do with people is always going to be more important than a financial, or it's not more important, but more challenging than a financial challenge, for example. But I've learned as I go. I mean, I know a lot of people do have that sort of a background or training, and I wish, I guess, to a degree that I had some, but for me, I learned as I went.
And what would you say to sort of the budding migration lawyers in the audience today? And I know that's the focus of your practice now, and you've had a variety of roles over the years, but it's been predominantly migration law. Is that an area that you intended to practice in? What are your key highlights? What's drawn you to it over the years?
I think what drew me to it was the people. I mean, actually getting to interact with individuals on a daily basis. I didn't want to be buried in paper. I didn't want to be dealing with a HR person or, some accountant, or I didn't want to do the more transactional work, I guess is where I was coming from. I mean, there's a lot of visa processing stuff that is transactional, but at the end of the day, it relates to a human being. And that was what I wanted to do. And the other aspect of that was wanting to try and actually make that positive change in somebody's life, or help them to make that positive change. I think, and I would say to anybody who's watching or listening today, it is the best area to practice in. But that's because I'm completely biased. But I would also say that it's not without its challenges. I think a lot of, the Migration Act, if I'm not wrong, is the second most complex or longest act that we have, second only to the Tax Act. And it is constantly changing. And anybody who looks at the newspapers knows this. There's constantly coverage. It is a political hot button. It is constantly under scrutiny, rightly or wrongly so. And I have to say, some of the things that I see in the media are quite soul destroying, and I try and avoid certain channels or certain publications for obvious reasons. But I think if anybody who, is considering immigration as a profession, I think it's fantastic. I think you have to be adaptable. You have to be quick on your feet, because various ministers will throw things at you that you're not always expecting. And you've got to be a people person. That would be my insight, I think.
Thanks, Catherine. Amy, I feel like I have an ally in you, because you used to work on the dark side with me before moving across. And I know you're based in Darwin, as we can all see with your wonderful background. Tell us a little bit about your journey. And I know you're relatively early in your career compared to our other panelists, but you've had a bit of a drastic change in the last few months. What's been the basis for that? What's challenging you now? And then what's the rewarding aspects of your role over at NAJA?
Yeah, thanks, Kitty. I suppose before I get into it, I'd just like to acknowledge the Larrakia people, who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land in which I'm speaking to you today. Pay my respect to the elders past, present and emerging. And rightly so, as you mentioned, I have had a fairly drastic change in my work and life in the last 6 months. I think 6 months ago, almost exactly, I moved to Darwin to work for the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, also called NAJA, which is the Aboriginal Legal Aid organisation in the Northern Territory. They're actually the largest provider of legal services in the Northern Territory in general, and their practice spans criminal, civil, as well as extending into social work, though I practice in the civil law section. Now, what that means, practically speaking, is we have quite a broad practice. I would say it involves litigation, so strategic litigation in the area of police and prison torts, so intentional torts, so battery, assault, false imprisonment, things like, and sometimes negligence, things like that, as well as some of the areas that a few of the other panelists have previously or currently practiced in, including housing, social security, discrimination law is a big one up here. I would say discrimination is a significant part of pretty much all my clients' experience, sadly, and that's something that we help them with where possible and within the confines of the Australian law. And also, in addition to that, we do sort of other areas in relation to compensation and also representing families in coronial inquests. That's quite a big issue. It can be from time to time, and it's a kind of different area of law where you can try to affect change for the future. Say something tragic has happened, you can try to help find out why that happened and see if there's things that can be done to make systemic change possible so that things like this don't happen in the future to Aboriginal people, especially Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory who are statistically very vulnerable and often living, as for instance Sarah mentioned, in poverty, and that's a reality for most Aboriginal people, especially in remote communities in the Northern Territory. Of course, before this, where I first started my career, I guess you could say, was in Sydney. So at Allens, where Kithy now works, I started as a summer clerk, I would say maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And after that, I did proceed to spend a couple of years in their graduate program as a solicitor at Allens, firstly in the intellectual property group, and then secondly in disputes and investigations, which, well, the name speaks for itself. And now I have to actually say though, you know, although it is, I guess, at least jokingly the dark side for the purposes of this conversation, I did go to Allens with a genuine desire and interest in practicing in those areas of law. You don't necessarily come out of law school with a fully formed understanding of where it is you want to be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years time. And I've always had quite diverse interests that I wanted to explore, which included, intellectual property, litigation more generally. And having said that, I've always had a, deep passion and urge to, practice in an area that aligns with my social justice values as well. And I'd say that my current role is something that gives me that opportunity in spades, day in, day out. I'm practicing, I would say, in a social justice space, which is really rewarding and of course really challenging. I guess I would echo a lot of the other comments made in relation to working in Aboriginal legal aid or in legal aid, which is that you are working inherently within the constraints of a system that is fundamentally racist, especially in the way that it deals with Aboriginal people. And you have to try and find the best possible solution for people within a quite flawed system, and within, especially I would say, having learnt a lot of the laws that exist up here in the Northern Territory, there are certain things that sort of beg a belief, and I'm sure there's laws like this in every state and territory, but for instance, just to give you an example of one, in the Northern Territory, the limitation date for commencing litigation in the courts for an intentional tort against the police is 2 months. So you have 2 months from the date that something quite horrible has occurred to someone to find out it's happened, give them legal advice, take instructions, and then file a statement of claim in court. Now, we deal at NAJA with a lot of remote clients, so clients living in some of the most remote communities in Australia, to the point where we might only get to visit them once a month. And that too is a pretty significant undertaking. It involves, catching a flight somewhere or driving for half a day to get to this remote community, where you'll then spend a number of days conducting clinics and meeting them to get advice. So you can imagine that there's already so many sort of structural barriers to getting justice for people. But at the end of the day, that's honestly the most rewarding part of the job. Is I love the communities that I visit. I visit the Tiwi Islands, which is actually, fun fact, the second largest island in Australia after Tasmania, and it's off the coast of the Northern Territory. And they have a really interesting history that I recommend looking up in any event, but they managed to sort of scare off the colonial invaders back in the day. And obviously the situation is a bit different now, but I visited Tiwi Islands, and I visited parts of Arnhem Land as well, which is also a very, very interesting area with a really strong history and Aboriginal culture that continues to this day. Amazing areas to visit. And I love my clients. I love learning about these communities. I've never been more challenged, and I've never been in an environment that every single day throws up new and interesting situations and learnings. I think that I would never have had this opportunity really if I'd stayed in Sydney. I mean, I can say that much for sure, and I'm really grateful for it.
Great. I think we're all really selling the rural practice, moving out of home career at the moment. Thanks, Amy. And everything Amy's saying is true. Every photo I see and every day in your adventures is just so inspiring and looks very exciting. So I'm glad you've made this change, and it's all going well. I would love to keep talking about everyone's careers, because there's so many questions we have to ask, but we do have to move on to new topics. And an obvious one is the fact that I think we're all diverse women, and we're underrepresented in this profession. And one of the questions that's been asked by a couple of students is how we do deal with those feelings of isolation and being a minority in this profession. I might start with you, Yorana, just about reflecting on your career and even currently being in a male-dominated industry. You're facing any barriers and challenges arising from being a diverse woman. How do you tackle that, and how do you embrace that, and how do we work through it collectively?
So I think if I can go back again to my early career, and perhaps it was as a result or a product of working in Aboriginal communities, I never felt that being a woman from a diverse background was an impediment. In fact, in those days, it was actually something that was that allowed me a bond with the clients, with the community, etc., because I was an outsider and they felt marginalised and being outsiders. So, in fact, if anything, my diversity was a way in which that bond was created. When I started at the Western Aboriginal Legal Service as a young solicitor, I was the only female. And there were some challenges. I mean, I was speaking to somebody earlier today about a solicitor, a male solicitor who was working there at the time, and I was 26, who made some advances that were not exactly welcome. And I don't know where it came from, because I was young and I was in a place that was quite, as I say, isolated. But I went to my senior solicitor, who was male, and made a complaint about that approach, that unwelcome approach. And I was very fortunate in that senior principal solicitor, male, but immediately confronted that other solicitor and basically gave him an ultimatum that either he resigned or he'd be sacked. So I was fortunate in that the people that worked around me, and particularly who were senior to me and were my mentors, were people with whom I could, or on whom I could rely for support. even though I was the only woman there at the time. In terms of my experience when I moved back to Sydney, again, I was working in legal aid. There were a number of other female solicitors there at legal aid, but, and this is something that I found since, there seems to be like a cap, and I know the glass ceiling. There are very few women in leadership roles. So that's something that I've always found very difficult. And I think the way that you overcome that difficulty is, I suppose when you're starting out, is by having mentors, people that you can turn to for support and for advice, and just to draw some strength from. Because although things I think are changing, they're changing very slowly. There seems to be more women now in the profession from diverse backgrounds, although again, not really in leadership roles. But I think if, in terms of how you deal with the difficulties and the challenges, for me, it's always been about having people with whom I can connect with, mentors, people who I can turn to for support. That's been a very important thing. And perhaps I've just been fortunate in that I have found those people in the areas in which I've worked. But I think there are challenges, and I've always said and continue to say that we need more women in the profession in senior positions, because that is really the only way that we're going to affect change, and the only way in which we're going to forge a path for women, particularly women of diverse background in the profession.
And why do you think we're not making it through? I feel like we see diversity in law school, we see diversity even at entry level, and then everyone disappears sort of a couple of years in. Is it the lack of visibility? We don't see that representation at senior ranks, so particularly at challenging points of your life when you're thinking about carrying responsibilities and other challenges. Is that the hurdle, that we're not seeing that visibly represented?
Well, I think that's right, but we're not seeing it physically represented because I just don't think that there are enough women of diverse background in those leadership roles. So when you look at, I mean, I don't know what it's like in the private profession. I will leave that to Kirti to comment on. But when you look at the bar, when you look at heads of jurisdiction, when you look at women on the bench, when you look at those very senior roles, how many of those women come from diverse background? I mean, one, you've got the challenge of having a woman at all in a position of leadership, but we've got the double whammy in the sense that how many women from a diverse background do you see in positions of leadership in the profession? So I think that is the problem, because I think if you, as a woman from a diverse background, if you are in a position of leadership, given your experience, given your knowledge, you have more opportunity to affect real change because you know what needs changing. So unless we get more women from a diverse background in those positions of leadership, then that change will be very slow. It'll be hit and miss. Some people who don't come from diverse backgrounds may have the best of intentions, but I don't know that they necessarily have a deep understanding of what's required to implement change. So yeah, that's a challenge. That's a challenge we've still got to deal with.
Over to you, maybe Catherine, to comment on, you're a diverse woman in a leadership position. What's made you persevere and get to this part of your life? If you've faced any challenges and barriers along the way, particularly unique to the fact that you're a diverse woman, something that might not be encountered by a woman that doesn't identify as a diverse woman or a man. How have you worked through that, and why do you think those challenges present themselves?
I think the biggest, look, I agree with everything Hirona said. I think the biggest challenge that I faced was just struggling to actually find my voice, because when I started, I was very often the only diverse person in a room, let alone, a diverse woman. I think over time, certainly that has changed, but there are still meetings that I sit in where I feel like I'm the youngest, the most obviously diverse, and, you know, the person with the least value really at the table, because that's just the way the system is, and that's the way the profession can sometimes make you feel. I think it's very hard to be what you cannot see. I felt that from day one, even in law school, and then certainly when I actually went out into the profession. And that's part of the reason I continue, I think, to try to stretch myself or to push myself into positions that perhaps I'm a little bit apprehensive about. Certainly, I think it's important to try and pave the way in a small way, but to make it a little easier for somebody who might be, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years behind me in terms of where they are in their career, so that they don't feel those feelings, or they don't have any problems actually speaking up and feeling like they deserve to be at the table, which of course they do. I think that is a real push for me in terms of why I keep doing it, even though I have the panic attacks at home separately.
Oh, I know, I can imagine. Sarah, what's it like at Legal Aid? I can imagine there aren't many people that look like you and I floating around in leadership roles, but what do you think is a state of play? How have you dealt with any challenges you've faced over your career?
Legal Aid, when I looked at the annual report most recently, the makeup of Legal Aid is about 75% women. In the civil jurisdiction, there's a lot of, there's even probably more women. So there's a lot of women, but and there are some women of colour, and there's women of that are underrepresented. There will be some of those women in all those different subgroups. But when you talk about leadership, the numbers definitely start to thin out. So Legal Aid is, like I said, an institution like all other institutions, and it suffers from the same issues around stratification, the way all of society is stratified. So it's like I said, it's had one female CEO from my recollection, having spoken to people, and for the first time in its history has had its first black CEO with Brendan Thomas. He's an Aboriginal man, and that's a historical moment, and it's great because it's not Aboriginal Legal Aid, as he would say to you. It's not the ALS, it's Legal Aid. So he'll say that, as soon as we have more and more Aboriginal staff, for the first time we've got the black lawyers representing the white clients. So he's always thinks it's quite funny. It's a good joke because obviously, that's not the way society's structured at the moment. So anyway, in saying that, all of the directors majority of them are women, but the majority of them are not the majority. They're all they're all white women, and so I'm not, I don't see myself in those executive roles. Although I've sat around, when I was the solicitor in charge, I was part of the executive team in civil. So the executive team is also made up of all of the senior managers, just a subset of them, but also I was the only woman of colour. So mostly women, again, around the table, which is also an underrepresented class within the legal sector. But again, it's very isolating to look around the room and to find yourself the only one. And also when Catherine's talking about finding your voice in that space, I have no problem speaking, but it's also being heard. It's one thing to speak, it's one thing to have a voice, it's one thing to express yourself, but to be heard it's a very different experience. So I also encourage students that it's important to find a space where you feel really safe along the way and to keep moving when you don't. If you don't feel heard, I think you should keep moving. I think you should keep expressing yourself. You're not always going to be heard. That's just the way it goes, really. So I think that you can't really be born as a minority and hope to get anywhere without growing really, not just thick skin, but resilience. And so that's why when Judge talks about the other set of skills that we have, so women are always already starting off, on the back foot anyway. So any other barrier you have just means that you need to keep being more and more resilient, and you need to keep fighting for your spaces everywhere, really. And so as soon as I did get any powers as in management powers, I used those to make sure that I tried to make the pool of people that not just look like me, but that come from Western Sydney, because that's where I grew up, that come from Western Sydney or from any other background that was somewhat underrepresented, that I created space for that. So I started a PLT program it's all been suspended now because of COVID, but I started that program and just actively had a pool of students that I would, not just myself, because at that stage there's these layers of management, but that I was just trying to mentor and create pathways, because there just needs to be more numbers, and you need to start off with the numbers. And you also you don't just start off going, I'm in a minority, I should be represented. You need to prove yourself. Wherever you are, you need to prove yourself. So by the time I'd worked out that I was underrepresented, it was after I'd achieved something. So I needed to get all these outcomes for my clients and then go, should I be somewhere else? Should I be then elevated in some way because I've now achieved something? So I think that's really important, that you can't just start off with a sense of entitlement. I mean, you need to first work really, really hard. You need to achieve good results for your clients. You need to, wherever you are, even if it's transactional law, like I do think you need to prove yourself to yourself first and then to others. But proving yourself to others when you are from any minority background will wear you down at some point.
What's motivated you to do all these great things, Sarah? Have you had a mentor, or have you been motivated by a particular person, especially if you might be the only woman of colour around a leadership table and voice isn't necessarily heard all the time? What's been your guiding light or sense of purpose, really, to make this happen?
I come from a disadvantaged background, so it's probably my own life story, but without telling you my life story on a recording, but obviously Catherine was saying she's a migrant. Like, I'm a first generation migrant, and my parents migrated from Egypt, and I spoke English as a second language. And so I've experienced probably all these different barriers, all of them. And so for me, when I think about clients, although I'm not doing that work immediately right now, I just think that there's not much that would separate me from being a client of legal aid. And that should be something that everyone should be cognizant of, that it's not that there's a very thin line in society, and that's what we're experiencing right now, that it's not that hard for people to fall from a secure life to one where there's so many other barriers and everything's insecure. So I think, and I just think, I don't know, I think I've always been someone that's headstrong, passionate, and so along with whatever life experiences, that's just kind of what's, like, I've always had that desire for a better world, or to at least attempt to be adding value in that way. But realistically, it's all little milestones that you're, working towards. And I do think that change is very slow. And sometimes change is, 2 steps forward and then 1 step back. Because when I go to talks, when I listen to feminists, Eva Cox, who I quite like, she's been around for a while, she'll tell you that. And some of the things she talks about are things she was talking about 30 years ago. So imagine talking about the same thing for 30 years and not seeing that change. So I think that you have to always know that there is the possibility, because if you have no hope, what's the point? But I do think you have to be steadfast and long-suffering with anything.
Well, you inspire us all, Sarah, so we'll be inspired by your role modelling in this space. Abby, I might quickly check with you, because you're starting out in your career. We've done so much in such a short period of time. How important is it for you to see representation of women of colour, people from diverse backgrounds in your leaders, people you report to? I think there was a comment about private practice, a commercial law profession. It's not that different. Can count people with one hand probably from diverse backgrounds in partnership levels anyway. Is that something that you are actively thinking about, you notice if you've received the benefit of, how that's made a difference to you?
I think that it's definitely something I appreciate. It does feel good to go somewhere where you can see, maybe to work somewhere in any event where you can see people who maybe are diverse in some way or have some kind of shared history with you. It's nice to be able to bond with people on that additional level. I guess looking back at the places I've worked, maybe quite early in my career, I worked somewhere where I'd say maybe I was the only non-white person at this law firm, and the difference between working there and, in retrospect, the difference between how I felt working there and at pretty much every other workplace I've worked at since, where there have been, there's always been at least one non-white person there, for instance, and certainly more women in any event, is, I think, pretty huge. Now, I guess I have historically, and this is often the case when you're moving through the legal profession, it can be quite male dominated in certain spaces, and on top of that, quite dominated by sort of white people, I guess you could say. So I think historically, maybe I've sort of developed modes of communicating or being that allow you to move more freely through these spaces. I mean, it's not something that people talk about often, but you do, for example, sometimes have to, I don't know, maybe you moderate yourself in a certain way. And I think that that's not something that you'd want to do forever. It would be really great if we could maybe get to a point where no matter where you go to work, it's a fairly equal representation of the kind of diversity we see in society, and especially in law firms and legal practice and so on. I know that community legal centres, so they tend to be fairly diverse as far as gender is concerned. So at the moment, I mean, the civil law team that I work in is, it's 90% women, I would say. There's 2 men in our team, and they're both very lovely, I should add. So we sometimes joke that if there was a sort of headstrong male in their roles, they would just be getting no time from the rest of us. But they're both very gentle, lovely men who really care about making a difference for Aboriginal people. And I guess, as someone who's a bit earlier in my career, then it is something that I would like to see, and I am seeing changing for the better. I do see more and more. I do feel like I have more and more colleagues who are diverse, more and more mentors who are diverse, and I think obviously in groups like Diverse Women in Law have an important step as well to play in connecting women who are seeking that diversity in their profession. So yeah, I think those are my comments.
Thanks, Amy, because obviously it's one aspect of actually progression, representation, being in a position of leadership, but then there's that whole inclusion piece, right? Being yourself at work, owning your diversity, owning your background. That only really comes with time when you see yourself represented in the workplace. Because I also struggled, like you were saying, about the modes you develop and the personas you sort of learn to put on over time, subconsciously even when you start out. Love to see, I think, in a world where we don't have to do that, which we're a little bit further away from, but hopefully we get there. Moving on to a new topic, because we are running out of time, and majority of the people that are in today's session are students studying law at Wollongong Uni. Going back to being a student, and we think about what sort of things we did, what opportunities we took advantage of, whether it was internships or volunteering, how you really transitioned going through a law degree, although everyone's had a diabolical year as a law student, so I feel really bad for all of you. It was very different being in law school when I was in it. Catherine, do you have any advice for students who are here today? What sort of things they should be doing, particularly given so many are interested in the social justice, human rights space? Things that they should put their hands up for, keep an eye or ear out for, things they should get involved in?
I was a social justice warrior too at university, which is probably not a surprise. I do feel sorry because COVID is obviously going to impinge on your ability to take part in a lot of these sorts of programs. My advice to anybody would I guess, under normal circumstances have been to contact your community legal centre that's near a community legal centre that's near you, or one that you're particularly interested in terms of the work that they do, and volunteer. I think for me, certainly, that's how I got exposed to legal practice, and that's how I actually worked out that I did want to be a solicitor after all. I got a couple of volunteer spots. I was thrown in at the deep end because community legal centres are like that. You get fantastic experience there because obviously they are under-resourced, so you tend to get pretty hands-on, you know, under supervision, of course. And it actually solidified, for me anyway, that I'd made the right career choice. Now, how you translate that to today's world with COVID, I'm not exactly sure. But I think that that's probably something for you to keep your eye on next semester, possibly when things are a bit more back to normal, and these sorts of opportunities come up. I think the one thing I probably regret not doing as a student was trying out more things. I think that's the opportunity that you have as a student that you're probably not going to have once you've finished your degree. But, you know, put your hand up for anything that you think possibly might be something that you're interested in. If nothing else, you work out that it's not for you and that's not an area you're interested in, and you move on. You haven't really lost anything. You've actually gained quite a bit.
And as someone that might be looking at prospective applicants or students or PLT students, what are the sort of skills and attributes you look for, Catherine, in people that might apply for a role in your practice?
I think, you know, obviously I work at a boutique firm. So I guess the things that appeal to us as a boutique law firm, a small firm, are probably different than maybe the sorts of things that would appeal to the bigger firms. But what we like to see is personality and certainly extracurricular activities outside your law degree. You know, law students are all type A people, they're all very high achieving. So you have an expectation, I guess, in terms of the sorts of candidates you're going to see. What we like to see is something a little bit different, a little bit outside the box. Volunteer work, you know, somebody who's got good grades, yes, that's important, but it's not everything. And I think the soft skills that a lot of law students do have, particularly in areas that are more alternative, where you're actually involved with people on a daily basis, the soft skills are really quite important, I think.
I might also ask you, Sarah, you've already talked about your PLT program, so I suspect you might have some people that are interested in learning a little bit more about that, particularly once it's up and running again. What are the sorts of things that Legal Aid looks for in law students or student applicants, either if they're coming on as a volunteer or as a lawyer? If you're involved in that sort of stage, what is something that stands out to you in a student? You have to go off mute, sorry.
So I'm not running that program anymore because I'm in a whole different area, and I don't know, my understanding is even that manager that took up the job that I was in, I don't think she's running it anymore either. But for the time that I was in that space, I obviously, the management at Legal Aid involves, I think about 30 to 40% involves recruitment. And so for the first time I learnt, you know, really, I thought that there was going to be really deep insights into why everything is so skewed, but there really isn't. It's not like some master plan or anything. It basically, you know, your resumes, you should try and make sure your friends or, you know, proofread them and make sure they're really clear what you've done in terms of your experience and how you set it out, so that it's easy to read, and your cover letters so people can, you know, read over it and check it. But definitely volunteer work is difficult because the PLT program was volunteer. So we would still be looking for people that had volunteered before they even got to volunteer at Legal Aid. And that's just the nature of kind of, it's not to say that people that had never worked in the legal sector didn't get a chance. There was lots of people that had come from working at Woolworths and Coles and supermarkets that just started out as well. But I do think that the interpersonal skills, problem solving and interpersonal, because Legal Aid clients, some of the most marginalised people in society. So they come with lots of mental health issues and, you know, English as a second language. So many of that requires a lot of your ability to communicate with clients and also get to what the issue is. And because when you are doing any work at legal aid, just like CLCs, they just throw you in there. You just get to do stuff straight away. There's always support, there's always solicitors, but even PLT students would still, with assistance of a solicitor, take instructions. They would still assist in writing letters, things that at big firms it would take a while before you were doing as a PLT at legal aid. But even there's paralegal roles at legal aid as well. It's just highly competitive, but I think that you should, any government role involves basically learning some strategies, like the STAR is situation, task. I think it's
action and result, I think.
What was it, Action and result. Yeah, so the STAR. So that's how you write. You write your cover letters, so you've basically shown that you're competent or you have capabilities in those areas. It's a very linear way of thinking. It's not as outside of the box as Catherine, but because they try and use this, what they say is a merit selection process. So I think that if you went onto the government website for jobs, I definitely think you should look at how it's done. But maybe Keithy will at one stage think about how you can do a session on, you could do a whole session on how to write applications for government jobs, because it's like a whole different set of skills. It's like a whole different set of skills compared to just going to a employment agency. You just got to write a cover letter that gets all of the main points in 2 pages, and you've got to get a good CV. But generally speaking, I'd suggest that all the things that Catherine said I agree with, volunteering as much as you can. But I also do regret that I was not more politically active, because I think, I have so much more to lose now when I have children, a huge mortgage, and it's just so much more complicated as you get older. And that's why I think people become more and more conservative as they get older, because they fear the loss so much more. And that makes sense in a very pragmatic way. And I think women should speak about money a lot more. They should speak about salaries. They should speak about that stuff a lot more, because not only, statistically are women retiring with less money, but they just don't know what the gap is in actual real terms. They don't speak about money enough.
It's this unspoken subject.
Yeah. And so I think that as young girls, a lot of you, or even if you're not, the point is financial security matters. And I think you should get on top of that early and take risks early, because it's harder to do later on. So it's not necessarily that, not only does your legal career sometimes pigeonhole you wherever you start, it might be where you end up over years, but it's also that it's just harder to take financial risks the further you go along the line. So it's easier to do when you still live at home, quite frankly. It's just easier to do when you don't have to, insure the shelter for your family. Then you can just do that. You do that, you take the big risks. You try all the areas, you volunteer in every area, because you just really don't know until you've had a go. So try to do that. Try and do it as much as you can. And I also, on a positive note, I also graduated and started off during the financial crisis in 2008. And I actually have an economics degree and a law degree, but I started off working using my economics degree before I'd always had a background in law. I did so many things anyway. It didn't take me long to work out that I was also not changing the world being an auditor, and I really missed the law. But my point about that is that it all works out. Like, the economy it's a cycle. So it moves down and it moves back up again. So it's a tough time to graduate or to, be studying law, but it's okay. It will work out. You've just got to kind of ride the wave going down and try and volunteer and as much as you can and get all that experience while you can anyway. So if you get another year of getting experience in all these different areas, it will really give you a better insight as to what you want to do later on anyway, what you want to spend 10 years doing, that kind of thing.
Thanks, Sarah. On that very strong note, I might actually say we probably have time for one question if anyone has anything to ask any of the panelists. Grace, I know you were moderating that. I know we've got a couple of minutes before everyone has to go. Does anyone want to ask a question directly? Otherwise, I'll wrap up. I'm not sure, Grace, if you've received anyone's.
Not during, but if anyone has a question, feel free to like raise
Welcome to jump in.
yourself off mute. Yeah.
Whilst we're talking about, does someone want to ask something? Go ahead.
Yes, I had a question. I'm going to be graduating at the end of the year, which is very exciting, but also quite scary. So I just want to ask, I guess it's a hard decision. Like, do you try and be financially stable, or do you try and get as much legal work experience as possible? Because it's kind of a fine line, and yeah.
It's a difficult question. And very easy to say from a position of, either having secure employment or with the benefit of hindsight, looking back and thinking what you could have done. Sarah, I feel like you asked for this question based on what you said earlier. Did you have anything to say in response?
No, I think it's just very personal. Like, it's a decision based on what your life experiences are at that point in time. But I've definitely, I'm making assumptions, and the assumption is that you might be still at home. If you're living independently, it makes it harder. But if you are still at home, then you take advantage of that, hopefully. If your parents are either not charging you anything or charging you minimal, take advantage of that, because the world's out there where you have to fend for yourself or then fend for others. It makes it harder. So I do think you only, Keithy or Catherine, you also, I think, touched on that. But what do you think? Like, I just kind of think there's only that real chance.
It's a very personal decision. You're right.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest, half the reason I really like a commercial law career is it comes with stability, it comes with resources, it gives you that peace of mind to then do other things with your life, and to not be burdened with those thoughts about, and I live here without parents, and we have to pay rent, and we have other things to think about. So it does get harder as you get a bit older, but for me, having that baseline comfort and that sort of safety net has helped me to go off and do other things. So I very much went down the commercial clerkship, commercial law firm path, and resources and getting to meet people, and through other opportunities, you can still make a difference and explore your passion. So I veered to that side of the fence. But I don't know, Catherine, if you have a different view.
I volunteered at CLC, so that was where I got my legal experience, and I had a part-time job that was non-legal that supported myself, that let me support myself, because that was the opportunity that presented itself to me, I guess. Had I had an opportunity to get paid legal work, I didn't, but if I had that, then I would have probably picked that. So it wasn't ideal, I guess, in a way, but certainly it worked for me. And I think, like Sarah and Keithy have said, you have to make the decision that works best for you, because, for me, it was fine for 6 months. After about 6 months, I started scratching my head about, like, okay, what am I going to do next? Like, is this actually going to get me anywhere? Now I've got 6 months of volunteer experience on my CV at 2 different centres, but where's that actually taking me? So it's something that you're going to have to weigh up for yourself. But, if you can, absolutely volunteer. Obviously make sure that you can look after yourself and that you can support yourself.
Can I just add in respect of that, I think it really depends also on what you want to do, in what area of law you want to practice in. So, for instance, if it's crime and positions it's really competitive. It's highly competitive. So it may be that 6 months of volunteer work, if you can get it, is really important. Now, that may be a choice that's not financially stable, or that's going to give you an income. But it does depend upon whether you assess that at the moment I'm willing to forego that because that will give me the experience or the added advantage when I'm applying for a job in this particular field. And the other thing that I need to say to all of you is that, well, those of you who are in your, for instance, early or mid-20s, there is no time like that time, because you are, from my own experience, as you get older, you do become more established in your personal life, in what it is that you want to do or be in your later life, and you're going to take less risks. you're going to be less adventurous, you're going to be less courageous, you get more established. And that's not a bad thing, but you get more established. So it's going to be harder and harder to take those risks, and you won't. The best time to do it, as I found when I was at 26, going out to Western New South Wales on an income that was about $16,000 or $15,000 or $14,000, I can't remember now, but it was almost nothing. And if you ask me 10 years later or 15 years later whether I would have done that, unlikely, highly unlikely that I would have done. But that was the most rewarding, absolutely the most rewarding time of my professional life. So I think if you can, take the risks now, because you're going to miss those opportunities in 10 years' time or in 15 years' time.
Anyone else have a question? We just have time for one more. Lisa, would you like to ask?
Yeah, thank you. As a mature age student, I love, obviously I feel like I'm starting, back from everyone else, having that, not starting out young and that. And the options you're talking about getting up into leadership positions, are those things still possible for people that enter later to still be able to have that, the career progression, still reach those spots when you're competing with younger people? Is that something you think that is possible?
What do you think?
So I think it is possible. I don't think anything is not possible, Lisa. And I think that you might be competing with people who are younger, but you bring to whatever position you're applying for or work that you're applying for a life experience that somebody else who's younger than you may not have. So things balance out, and that life experience can give you qualities that are really important in the field that you want to work in, and may also be an advantage in seeing you progress in that field. So I don't think you should necessarily see the fact that you may not be as young as others who are starting out in their careers as a disadvantage, because there's that whole life experience that you bring to it that other people may not have.
And from my personal experience, when mature age students start at our firm, I find that, yes, you start at perhaps the same level as people slightly younger to you, but the acceleration of your career after that ends up being so quick, because you do come with such great life experience that you actually end up jumping those hoops a lot quicker, with more ease, with more resilience. And it's all those really great skills that you do bring with the benefit of age and life experience that I think isn't something that you'll find with people that are starting out in the profession. So agree. I don't think there's anything that's not possible, and you should definitely keep your eyes on that. We do have one last question from Hannah, and then we'll have to wrap up, if that's okay. Hannah, if you'd like to ask yours.
Yes, thank you. I am a student that is interested in working in criminal law reform and addressing some of those systemic issues that many of the panelists spoke about. I was nodding along. And I've already volunteered for an MP and worked on criminal law reform, and I've been trying to work at the Law Reform Commission. But I just wanted some suggestions on where else I should possibly volunteer, because it's not something that I guess many people are looking at, and I just am a bit clueless as where to go.
So can I just jump in very quickly here and just say this? I think it's really important for people who work in the area of law reform, particularly in criminal law, to have had some experience actually practicing it. What I find again and again is that policy about criminal law is often made by people who have no experience on the ground, and the policy is, well, let's just say problematic. So perhaps maybe one thing that you could think about is getting some experience in criminal law practice, or not for long, just some exposure to it, because I think that really informs law reform in the area. I mean, often you get people in law reform who are suggesting changes to the law or policy, and they've never practiced, and they just don't know the basics of how things work in crime. which can be problematic and can sort of impact upon the type of reform that you're seeking to do. So maybe one thing you can think about is actually getting some sort of practical experience in criminal law.
I might also jump in and just suggest maybe looking into doing an internship at NAJA. We have a law and justice team that pretty much the work of our criminal law team, which spans the Northern Territory, feeds into the law reform and advocacy work they do. They are, I think, doing very, very good and very important work, which might align with your interests. It sounds like it does.
Also, Hannah, obviously seconding what the judge has said, I definitely agree that you need to attempt to do some practical experience so that you can, you can speak to those points from that have that lens. But yeah, Legal Aid also has a strategic law reform unit that looks at law reform and basically comments and collates opinions, sometimes from the solicitors and sometimes, they just from their research and opinion. So that's also another area you can think of that works on those areas where every time there's a bill, they contribute towards ones that are relevant. So
Thank you.
I think we'll have to wrap up. It's nearly 7 o'clock. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you've enjoyed the session. It's been absolute pleasure being a moderator and being in the company of these wonderful panelists. Big virtual round of applause to all of you for being here and for our speakers today. Thank you in particular to Grace and Tony from the Law Society for organising this session. We really appreciate it. I know everyone is well and truly over the screen fatigue at the moment, but to have you join us and to show your interest and support for diverse women in law is really appreciated. So thank you all. Thank you, Catherine, Sarah, Judge Yahia, and Ami. I think Ami's background and the whistling of the birds has just made me lose focus today, but it's been really great seeing you all. Please stay in touch with DWL. We've got a couple of events coming up. We've got this advocacy program that we're hoping to run in the next couple of months, but we're looking to host further events and ways to keep in touch with all of you. So thank you. Nothing more from me, Grace, unless you wanted to add anything.
Nothing further from me other than thank you so much everyone for coming, especially big thanks to Keerthi and all of our amazing panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and also just for paving the way for diverse female identifying law students and just creating spaces for us to be seen and heard. As well, the event will also be uploaded to the LSS Facebook page for any students who couldn't attend. But yeah, thank you so much for coming and thank you for your time.
Thanks, Grace.
Thanks, everyone.